On the night of my 72nd birthday, while 40 guests laughed and clinked crystal glasses one floor below me, I found the date of my own erasure sitting in a printer tray. I had climbed the stairs of the house my son ran, now the house I built, the house I paid for, the house where my wife took her last breath looking for nothing more sinister than a fresh ream of printing paper. The scholarship committee for my late wife's maritime foundation needed the final list of orphan sailors' children we were sponsoring this year, and the old printer in my private study downstairs had run dry. So I walked into Nathaniel's home office, the office that used to be mine, and I reached into the paper tray of his gleaming new laser printer. My fingers touched paper that was still faintly warm. Somebody had printed something less than an hour ago and forgotten to collect it. I lifted the small stack out of the tray with the idle intention of setting it politely on the desk. Then the heading at the top of the first page caught the light of the desk lamp, and the entire world tilted half a degree beneath my feet. Petition for guardianship and conservatorship, in the matter of Elias Rourke. My name, my full legal name, typed in cold, indifferent bureaucratic letters. Below it, paragraph after paragraph of clinical language, describing an elderly man suffering from progressive cognitive decline, disorientation, memory failure, and an inability to manage his personal, financial, and medical affairs. The petition asked the court to strip that elderly man of every legal right he possessed and hand complete, permanent, unchallengeable control of his life to his devoted, concerned, long-suffering adult son. The elderly man was me. The devoted son was Nathaniel, and the hearing date typed neatly at the bottom of the page was 3 weeks in the future. They had already scheduled the end of my life as a free man. They had already picked the day. Paper clipped behind the petition was a glossy, full-color brochure for a place called Golden Harbor Senior Living Community. Smiling, silver-haired models played chess in a sunlit atrium. Somebody had gone through that brochure with a red ballpoint pen and circled 3 of the smallest, cheapest rooms, the ones described as cozy interior suites, which is the kind of language people use when a window would cost extra. I stood absolutely still in that quiet office, holding my own execution order in my 2 weathered hands, listening to the muffled sound of Happy Birthday being rehearsed by the caterers downstairs. And I want you to know exactly what I did not do. I did not shout. I did not storm down those stairs. I did not tear the papers into pieces. 40 years of command at sea teaches a man one lesson above all others. A captain does not learn his ship is sinking from the alarm bells. He learns it from a half-degree tilt in the deck that nobody else can feel. The alarms come later, when it is already too late. I felt the tilt, and I stayed on my feet. My name is Elias Rourke. I am 72 years old. For 4 decades I was a merchant marine captain, and before this story is over, the people who printed those papers were going to learn what 4 decades on the open ocean actually does to a man's mind. My name is on this story. My hands are on the wheel. And if you are listening to this right now, do me one small favor before we sail any further. Tell me in the comments exactly where in the world you are listening from, and subscribe to this channel, because you are going to want to hear every single minute of how I dismantled these people without ever raising my voice. Because there was one more detail on that petition. One detail worse than the date, worse than the circled rooms. At the bottom of the final page, in the section reserved for the supporting witness attesting to my mental decline, there was already a signature. Elegant, confident, dry for at least an hour. It belonged to Sloane, my son's wife. The woman who, 40 minutes earlier, had kissed my cheek at the front door and told me she thanked God every day that I was still so sharp. Let me tell you who I am, so you understand precisely what kind of man they decided to declare incompetent. I went to sea at 17 with a canvas bag and my father's debts. I came home at 61 with a shipping company that bore my name, 4 decades of logbooks written in my own steady hand, and a reputation in every port from Rotterdam to Singapore. I spent my entire working life as the master of ocean-going cargo vessels, 40 years of typhoons in the South China Sea, engine fires in the middle of the Atlantic, and crews of 30 men who trusted me to bring them home to their families, which I did, every single voyage, without ever losing a man. But here is the part of my profession that no landsman ever thinks about. A captain's most dangerous enemy is not the weather, it is paper, forged manifests, phantom cargo listed in empty holds, bills of lading with doctored dates, custom stamps pressed by hands that never held authority, signatures traced by patient criminals in the back rooms of a dozen ports. Over 40 years, I personally caught more fraudulent documents than most customs officers see in a career, because when a captain signs a manifest, he is signing with his license, his ship, and his freedom. I have signed 10,000 manifests in my life. I know what a lie looks like when it wears a stamp. Remember that. It matters later. It matters more than anything. My wife Camille passed away 5 years ago, taken from me over 14 slow, merciless months while I held her hand in this very house. We were married for 43 years. She waited on shore through every voyage, raised no complaints and no children. The sea took that possibility from us early, in a way I will not detail here, and she filled the space where children would have been with a heart so vast it eventually adopted a stranger. That stranger was Nathaniel. I need to tell you how Nathaniel came into my life, because you cannot understand the size of this betrayal until you understand the size of the debt. 20 years ago, I was running a container route through the North Sea in late February, and we hit weather that the forecasts had promised would pass south of us. The forecasts lied. 40-foot swells, wind that screamed through the rigging like something alive and furious, green water coming over the bow and walls, and in the middle of the worst of it, a deck cable snapped, and a 21-year-old deckhand on his second voyage, a skinny, quick-smiling kid from nowhere, with no family listed in his file, and no one waiting for him in any port on earth, was swept over the rail and into the black water. Maritime law is brutally clear about what a captain owes the many versus the one. In seas like that, you mark the position, you throw the beacon, and you do not risk the ship. Every man on my bridge knew it. I knew it. I gave the wheel to my first officer, and I went down to the rail myself. I was 52 years old. I put myself in a harness, and I went into the North Sea in February after a boy whose name I barely knew, because somewhere behind me in the howling dark I could hear Camille's voice the way I always could in the worst moments, and Camille would never have forgiven me for arithmetic. I found him. God alone knows how, but I found him, half frozen, and I held that boy against my chest in freezing black water while the crew hauled us both back aboard. And when we hit the deck, he was weeping and clawing at my coat and repeating the same 4 words over and over through blue lips. "Don't let go, Captain. Don't let go." I did not let go. Not that night, and not for 20 years afterward. Camille and I brought Nathaniel into our home. We paid for his officer's training. We stood in the front row at his wedding to Sloane, and when my knees and my doctors finally forced me ashore for good, I did the thing that childless men dream of doing. I handed the company Rourke Maritime, my whole life's work, every vessel and contract and dollar of it, to the boy I pulled out of the sea. I moved into the east wing of my own house as a guest of honor, and I told my lawyer, my banker, and God himself that I had not lost a son to the ocean after all. The ocean had simply taken 40 years to deliver him. That is the man they decided to erase. That is the mind they decided to call broken. I stood in that office for a long time with the petition in my hands, and I did the arithmetic that no father should ever have to do. The signature of Sloane on the witness line. The hearing date, 3 weeks out, filed by an attorney whose letterhead I recognized, Ambrose Langley. The silver-tongued family lawyer Nathaniel had brought into our affairs 2 years ago. The one with the soft handshake and the eyes that never once smiled when his mouth did. The brochure with the red circles. The warmth of the paper. Somebody had printed this tonight, during my birthday party, while the cake was being lit, and then my eyes drifted to the hallway beyond the office door, to the long shelf where the treasures of my life at sea stood in a patient row, and I noticed, with a small, cold, quiet click somewhere deep in my chest, that something was missing from it. The brass compass was gone. Not any compass, Camille's compass. A heavy, beautiful, 19th century ship's compass in a brass housing that she had hunted down through 3 antique dealers and given to me on our 10th anniversary, with my initials and hers engraved together on the base, so that in her words I would always be able to find my way back to her. That compass had stood on the same shelf for 5 years since her death, polished every Sunday by my own hand. It was the single most sacred object in this house, and someone had already begun to help themselves to my life, quietly, confidently, before the ink on the petition was even dry. You would think a man in that moment would break. You would think his hands would shake, his voice would fail, his heart would crack down the middle like a hull on a reef. And I will confess to you, standing alone in that lamplit office with the party glittering beneath my feet, I felt the crack begin. Then I heard Camille, the way I heard her in the North Sea, the last coherent thing she ever said to me, whispered from the hospital bed while her thin fingers pressed the pulse in my wrist, as if she were taking one final sounding of my depths. Elias, promise me, whatever comes after I'm gone, never let anyone put a price on your life. I looked down at the petition. Golden Harbor Senior Living Community, cozy interior suite. That was the price they had put on my life. One small room without a window, in exchange for everything I had ever built and everyone I had ever been. Here is the paradox I have carried ever since, the sentence that still wakes me at 3 in the morning. The only man I ever pulled out of the water was the one holding my head beneath it. I set the pages back in the printer tray. I squared their edges with the care of a man arranging evidence, because that is exactly what I was doing. I photographed every page with my phone in the lamplight, slowly, cleanly, without one tremor in my old hands. And then I walked back down those stairs, into the warmth and the music and the golden light, and I stood at the head of my own birthday table, and I looked at Nathaniel's proud smile, and Sloane's shining eyes, and the soft, patient, well-fed face of Ambrose Langley seated at my right hand like a cardinal at a king's table, and I smiled at all of them, wide and warm and grateful, and I blew out 72 candles in a single breath. They toasted my health. They toasted my long life. Sloane squeezed my shoulder and called me the anchor of this family, and I patted her hand and thanked her, and not one of them, not one, felt the deck tilt. Because they had made a mistake no sailor would ever make. They had mistaken an old captain's silence for the sea being calm. The next morning, I came down to breakfast and found that we had a guest. A pleasant, soft-spoken man with a leather bag and a careful smile, whom Nathaniel introduced, ever so casually, over coffee and fresh bread. A doctor, just stopping by, just to chat. And on the table beside his cup, face down but unmistakable, lay a document with a signature line and a date on it that I happened to know, with absolute certainty, was a lie. The doctor's name was Whitfield, and he shook my hand with the damp, practiced softness of a man who is paid to look concerned. Nathaniel poured me coffee with his own hands, a gesture of filial warmth he had not performed in years, and Sloane hovered at the edge of the breakfast room in a pale morning robe, watching me the way a cat watches a wounded bird from the top of a fence. Dad, Nathaniel said. He had started calling me Dad again only in the last few weeks, and I understood now exactly why we've been talking, Sloane and we just want to make things simpler for you. You've carried everything for so long. The company, the foundation, Mom's estate, all of it. We think it's time you got to rest. Ambrose Langley set down his coffee. He had arrived a few minutes after the doctor, unhurried, in a charcoal suit that cost more than a deckhand earns in a season, and he laid a slim leather folio on the breakfast table, with the reverence of a priest laying out the sacrament. Captain Rourke, he said, and his voice was a warm bath with something dead floating in it. These are simply some instruments to streamline the family's affairs. Nothing to trouble yourself over. Your son has your interests entirely at heart. He opened the folio and slid a document across the linen tablecloth toward me. It was a last will and testament, my last will and testament. It left the whole of my estate, the reclaimed company shares, the house, the Maritime Foundation, every account to Nathaniel, solely and completely, and it cut out the Camille Rourke Foundation entirely, as though my wife's life's work had never existed. And at the bottom of the final page was a signature, my signature, dated 4 years ago. I have signed my own name well over 10,000 times in this life, on manifests and contracts and customs declarations in 40 ports across 4 decades. I know the exact weight of my own hand. I know where my E hooks and where my final K falls away, the way a man knows the sound of his own cough in a dark room. The signature on that page was a good forgery, a very good one, done by someone patient, with my real signature in front of them as a model. But it was not mine. The downstroke of the R leaned a half-degree wrong, and the paper it was printed on caught the morning light with a faint, cold, violet sheen that no paper stock in this country made 4 years ago. I let none of this reach my face. "I don't remember signing this," I said slowly, and I let my voice go thin and uncertain, testing them, laying out a little bait of my own. "Ambrose, I would remember signing something like this." And that is when I watched the trap I was standing in reveal every one of its teeth at once. "That's exactly it, Dad," Nathaniel said gently, and he reached across and covered my hand with his, and his eyes were wet, actually wet. 20 years I had loved that boy, and I had never once seen him produce tears on command, and it turned out he could do it as easily as turning a tap. "That's exactly what worries us. You signed this with Mr. Langley 4 years ago, in this very room, and you don't remember." "There was an incident, Captain," Dr. Whitfield murmured, opening a notepad. "2 nights ago. The gas range. I went very still." "You left the burner on," Sloane said from the doorway, and now her voice trembled with beautifully rehearsed fear. "The whole kitchen filled with gas. Consuela smelled it at midnight and turned it off. Elias, you could have killed us all. You could have killed yourself." She pressed a knuckle to her lips. "You didn't even remember it the next morning. You looked at me like I was making it up. I had not touched that range in 2 days. I knew it the way I knew my own name. But I watched the housekeeper, Consuela, a woman I had employed and paid well for 11 years, stand silently in the corner and nod, once without meeting my eyes, and I understood that she had been bought, or frightened, or both. And then Langley began to talk. He talked about diminished capacity and lucid intervals, and the compassionate reluctance of a family forced to intervene. He talked about sundowning, about the cruel arithmetic of a mind coming untethered from its moorings. He layered the legal and medical terminology on so thick and so smooth that it rolled over the table like fog rolling into a harbor. And for one single, terrible heartbeat, I want to be honest with you, because this is the part that predators count on for one heartbeat, sitting there surrounded by 4 confident faces, and a forged signature, and a doctor with a notepad, and a housekeeper who nodded. I felt the fog reach my own mind, and I heard a small voice ask, "What if they are right? What if you did leave the burner on? What if the tilt in the deck is in you? That is what this crime is. That is the whole engine of it. They do not simply lie about you. They make you doubt the log. But I have spent 40 years keeping a ship's log, and a captain's log does not lie. And a captain who cannot trust his own record is already dead in the water. So I reached into that fog and I took hold of the one fixed star I had. My memory is a logbook. I have never once entered a false position in 40 years at sea. I did not touch that range. Everything else in this room is weather." The fog cleared. I lowered my eyes to the table, and I let my shoulders sag, and I let them see a frightened old man surrendering. "I see," I said quietly. I didn't realize it had gotten so bad. The relief that flooded that room was obscene. Langley actually exhaled. Sloane crossed to me and folded me into an embrace, and murmured that everything was going to be all right now, that they were going to take such good care of me. And over her shoulder, in the mirror of the tall barometer that has hung on my dining room wall for 30 years, the brass and glass instrument I have consulted every morning of my life, to read the pressure of the coming day, I saw Nathaniel and Ambrose Langley look at each other. And I saw them smile. It was not a cruel smile. That was the worst of it. It was the easy, satisfied, professional smile of 2 men who have just watched a large and difficult piece of cargo settle safely into the hold. Langley reached into his folio and clicked his pen, a small dry sound, click, and it landed in my ear exactly like the sound of a hold hatch being dogged shut over a man's head. I patted Sloane's back and told her I was tired and would like to lie down. That night I did not lie down. I walked out to the boathouse. I keep a boathouse at the bottom of the property, on the little tidal inlet behind the house, where an old wooden launch sits under canvas and where, for 5 years, I have gone to be alone with the smell of salt and creosote and the past. Nathaniel and Sloane never come down here. Landsmen never do. The water makes them uneasy, and that unease was about to cost them everything. I sat on an overturned crate in the dark, and I took out of my coat pocket the one thing I had carried down with me. A small brass pocket compass, no bigger than a watch, the twin of the great ship's compass that had vanished from my hallway shelf. Camille had bought them as a matched pair on our wedding day, the great one for the house, the small one for my pocket, so that wherever the sea takes you, she said, some part of me is always pointing you home. I have carried it in my breast pocket over 4 oceans for 43 years. They had taken the large one. They did not know the small one existed. I turned it over and over in my fingers in the dark, and I let the grief come, and then I let it go, because grief is salt water and a drowning man does not drink the sea. Panic is the enemy of a clear mind. My old chief engineer used to say it in the worst moments in the engine room, hands black with oil, fire above us. Panic is the enemy, Captain. Fear the calm ones. I said it to myself in the dark of that boathouse until my pulse came back down to a steady sounding, until the frightened, betrayed old man went below, and the other man, the man who had brought 30 souls through a typhoon off Luzon and never entered a false position in his log, came quietly up onto the bridge. The captain inside me woke up, and the captain looked at the problem the way he had looked at 10,000 manifests, with cold and total clarity, and he saw it whole. They had built a beautiful vessel, a forged will 4 years old, a bought doctor, a staged gas leak with a paid witness, a wife's signature already dry on a guardianship petition, a hearing date set, a lawyer whose warm voice could turn a jury of a single judge into an executioner without ever raising it. If I fought them in the open, if I stood up in that breakfast room and shouted the truth, I would prove their entire case for them. The paranoid, agitated, delusional old man, ranting about conspiracies, insisting the forged signature wasn't his, accusing his loving family of trying to institutionalize him for money. Every word of protest would be another red circle in the Golden Harbor brochure. They had engineered it so that my sanity itself became the evidence of my madness. You do not fight a current like that head on. You will exhaust yourself and drown a fathom from shore. You let it carry you, and you use it to reach the one piece of ground the current cannot cover. They wanted to prove I was incompetent. Very well. I sat in that dark boathouse with my dead wife's compass warm in my fist, and I began, for the first time in 5 years, to smile, a real one this time, not the one I wore at the birthday table. They wanted to declare me incompetent. So I would show them, over the next 3 weeks, exactly how incompetent an old sea captain could pretend to be. I would be the most confused, cooperative, harmless old man they had ever seen. I would walk into their trap with my hands open and my eyes vacant, and I would let them tighten every knot themselves, one by one, until the noose they were building for me was strong enough to hold the full weight of all 3 of them. The compass needle, even in the dark, even in my closed fist, was doing the only thing it has ever done. It was pointing home. The performance began the next morning at breakfast, and I want you to understand that it was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than the North Sea, harder than burying Camille, because it required me to spit on my own dignity with a smile, and to do it convincingly enough to fool the people who had watched me for 20 years. I came down to the table, and I could not find the sugar. I stood there in front of the sugar bowl, which was 6 inches from my hand, and I looked around the room with mild, watery confusion until Sloane rose and fetched it for me and placed it gently before me and touched my cheek. "It's right here, Elias." I thanked her 3 times. Over the following days I asked the same question twice in an hour. I called Nathaniel by the name of a first officer, 30 years dead. I let my sentences trail off into the middle distance and left them there, unfinished, like a boat drifting off its mooring. I want to tell you what it costs a proud man to do this on purpose. Every fumble was a small death. Every time Sloane's eyes softened with false pity, every time Nathaniel exchanged a significant glance with his wife over my bowed head, a part of me that had commanded oceans screamed in a locked room below. But a captain who cannot swallow his pride to save his ship is no captain at all. And it was working. I could see it working. The more helpless it became, the more relaxed they grew, the wider their circle of confident conversation spread around me. Because a broken instrument is not watched, it is simply read. And then, at the end of the first week, I gave them the gift that turned their patience to greed. I set down my coffee one morning and I said, in a small, tired, frightened voice, "I've been thinking about that place. Golden Harbor. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should go and stay there. Just for a little while. Just to see. I don't want to be a danger to anyone." The silence that followed had a texture to it. I have felt that exact silence once before in my life on the bridge. The instant a following sea lifts the stern and every man on watch knows, without a word, that the wave has decided to take the wheel. It is the silence of people who cannot believe their luck and are terrified of breaking the spell by moving. Sloane recovered first. "Oh, Elias," she breathed. Of course. Whatever makes you feel safe." I had just volunteered to walk into the cell they were building for me. From their side of the table, it must have looked like the current had finally carried the old man exactly where they wanted him, without their even having to push. From my side, I had just requested my own transfer into the enemy's headquarters, with 3 catered meals a day, and no one watching the harmless furniture in the corner. Before I let them move me, I asked for one thing. I asked, in my quavering voice, to see the will one more time. "For Camille," I said, and I let my eyes fill, which was not difficult. "I want to read the part about her foundation one more time before I forget it all." Langley, who had returned for the triumphant paperwork, found this touching. Predators always find their victim's sentiment touching, right up until it becomes the blade. He slid the will across the table to me, and he even patted my hand. I held the pages up to the morning window, as though my old eyes needed the light to read the small print, and I read the light instead of the words. There it was, unmistakable now in the full sun, the faint violet fluorescence in the weave of the paper, the cold shimmer of a security watermark. I had spent 40 years learning to catch exactly this, the tiny anachronism, the cargo that doesn't match the age of the ship. I happen to know, because the Maritime Foundation buys its archival certificates from the same specialty mill, that this particular anti-counterfeit paper stock, with this particular watermark, had not existed anywhere in the world until it was introduced 2 years ago. And the ink of my forged signature had the faint iridescent sheen of a gel formulation that came onto the market in that same period. A document dated 4 years ago, printed on paper, and signed with ink that did not exist until 2 years ago. Phantom cargo in an empty hold. A manifest describing goods that were never loaded. I said nothing. I read the paragraph about Camille's foundation aloud in a trembling voice, and I let one real tear fall onto the tablecloth, and I handed the will back and thanked them, and the only thing I signed that morning was the leather guest register at Golden Harbor Senior Living Community when they checked me in 3 days later, into a cozy interior suite with no window and a view of the parking lot exactly as promised. They thought they had anchored me. They had, in fact, delivered me to a war room with a nurse call button, and no one who suspected the furniture could think. Golden Harbor gave me 2 things they never intended to give me. A telephone in the recreation garden that residents could use unsupervised, and long, empty, unwatched hours in which to use it. The first call I made was to a man named Cormac Ashford. 22 years ago, Cormac was a marine insurance fraud investigator, and a good one, and his career was destroyed in a single afternoon when a shipping conglomerate ordered him to sign off on a report declaring a scuttled vessel an honest accident. He refused. They ruined him, falsified his file, blacklisted his name in every port authority on the coast, and left him, at 40, with nothing. He came to me because I had captained one of their ships and knew the truth of the sinking. I could have stayed silent and kept my own contracts safe. Instead, I testified. I put my own livelihood on the reef for a man I barely knew, because a captain who lets an honest man drown to keep his cargo dry is not a man I could stand to be. It cost me 2 years of work and a great deal of money. It gave Cormac his name back, and it gave him a debt he had been trying to repay for 2 decades, and I had never let him. When I told him, from a garden phone in a memory care facility, what my son had done, there was a long silence on the line. And then Cormac Ashford said, in a voice I remembered from courtrooms, "Captain, tell me where you are, and tell me everything." The second call was to Beatrice Hale, a quiet, ferociously precise attorney who had handled Camille's foundation for a decade and who had never once, in all that time, lost a fight she chose to enter. I told her about the watermark. There was a pause, and then she said only, "If that's true, Elias, then they haven't committed elder fraud. They've committed felony forgery, and they've handed us the murder weapon with their fingerprints already on it. Do nothing. Break nothing. Let them keep believing they've won." Those were, more or less, my own instructions to myself, and hearing them come back in the mouth of a brilliant lawyer settled something in my chest. But the third ally I did not recruit. She recruited herself. There was a night nurse at Golden Harbor named Tessa Vaughn, a tired young woman in her late 20s with careful eyes, and I had been told, in a slip of Sloane's tongue during check-in, that Tessa will keep good notes on his condition for us. I understood at once what that meant. She had been hired, privately, by the family, to document my decline. She was a paid witness in waiting, another Consuela, another signature for the next petition. So I was careful around her. I fumbled and forgot and drifted, and I let her write it all down, until the night she found me at 2 in the morning in the darkened day room, reading Conrad's Typhoon in the original, unabridged, murmuring the lines I have loved for 50 years, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she said, very quietly, "You're not confused at all, are you, Captain?" I looked up at her, and I made a decision that could have ended everything, and I told her the truth. I told her about the will, the watermark, the staged gas leak, the petition Sloane had already signed. I watched her face, and I saw something move behind her careful eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. The terrible recognition of a person seeing an old wound reopened in someone else's flesh. "My grandmother," Tessa said finally, and her voice was not steady. "4 years ago, a man like your lawyer, a cousin nobody trusted." They said she was confused too. By the time anyone looked closely, the money was gone, and she was in a place worse than this one, and she died there in 11 months thinking her family had abandoned her. She looked at the notepad in her own hands, the notepad of lies she had been paid to write. I was a student. I couldn't do anything. I've had to watch it work, over and over, ever since, and I've never once been able to prove it. She sat down across from me in the dark. "Tell me what you need," she said. "I have access to everything, the medication logs, the family's instructions, and I can wear a recorder in this apron, and no one in this building would ever think to check the furniture." The furniture, she said. She used the same word I had used to myself. Over the days that followed, I let them tighten every knot. I signed the consent forms extending my evaluation period, which delighted Langley, because each extension made me look more compliant and more incompetent, and gave him more time to arrange the sale of everything I owned. I let Nathaniel visit and perform his tender son routine for whatever staff were watching. I let Sloane redecorate my study at the house. My study and heard, through Tessa, that Camille's brass compass now sat on Nathaniel's desk as an ornament, a trophy of conquest, which told me something important about the man I had pulled from the sea. He did not merely want what I had, he wanted to display it. And every night, in the unwatched garden, I gathered my crew by telephone. Cormac began pulling threads. Beatrice began drafting quietly. Tessa began recording. They believed the storm was over. They believed they had brought their cargo safely into port and dogged the hatches and could sleep. They did not know that the harmless old man in the windowless room had spent 40 years learning that the most dangerous moment in any voyage is not the height of the storm. It is the false calm at its center, the eye, the flat, bright, silent water, where inexperienced sailors relax and untie their lashings and step out on deck to breathe moments before the far wall of the storm arrives from the opposite direction, twice as hard, and takes everything that isn't tied down. They had sailed my family straight into the eye, and they had no idea there was a second wall coming. The evidence came to me in 3 tides, each one higher and colder than the last, and by the time the third had gone out again, I understood that I had badly underestimated the depth of the water I was standing in. The first tide was Tessa's recorder. She came to my room on a Tuesday, drew the curtain, and set a small digital recorder on the nightstand between us with the quiet ceremony of a surgeon laying out an instrument. "They had a meeting," she said, "in your old study. Langley, your son, and his wife. I was serving coffee. They forgot I was in the room. You'd be amazed how invisible a nurse's uniform makes a person." She pressed play. The audio was muffled by fabric but perfectly, damningly clear. And there, in the center of it, was the warm, unhurried voice of Ambrose Langley, giving instructions the way a director blocks a scene. He told them the hearing needed one more supporting incident on the record, something recent, something dramatic, something that would move the judge. He instructed them to report that I had wandered out to the marina in the middle of the night, disoriented, in danger, unable to find my way home. "Have the nurse date the note for this week," Langley said. "I'll draft an emergency addendum to the petition and file it before the hearing. A wandering incident near open water judges here, drowning risk, and they sign inside a day." Then Nathaniel's voice, and this is the part I have listened to more times than is good for a man. "He taught me to sail out of that marina," my son said, "not with guilt, as though the memory were an inconvenient knot. He never lets me forget it, any of it. 20 years of being reminded I'd be dead in a ditch without him." A pause. "Let's just get it done." There it was. The whole engine of the betrayal, laid bare in 9 seconds of muffled audio. It was not about the money, not entirely, not at the root. It was that I had saved him, and he had never once forgiven me for it. The debt I thought was love, he had carried all these years as a chain. He did not want to be free of me. He wanted to be free of the man who had made him. I sat with that for a long time. Then I set it aside, because grief is salt water, and I had a ship to bring in. The second tide was the medication log, and it was the one that frightened me. Tessa slid the photograph pages across my bed. My evening supplement, a mild herbal sedative the family had insisted I take, prescribed by good Dr. Whitfield to manage my agitation, had been quietly doubled 2 weeks earlier, then doubled again. On Sloane's written instruction, initialed in her own careful hand in the family directives file, the dosage climbing toward a level that would leave a 72-year-old man genuinely foggy, genuinely unsteady, genuinely prone to wandering out to a marina at 2 a.m. and not finding his way home. They were not only inventing my decline for the record, they were beginning to manufacture it in my body to make the lie true, so that if anyone ever did look closely, they would find a confused old man exactly as advertised. I had been palming those pills for a week on pure instinct, an old sailor's suspicion of anything that dulls the watch. That instinct, it turned out, was the thin margin between me and the marina. I flushed the evening supplement down the toilet from that night forward, and told no one but Tessa. The third tide required me to go home. In the dark. Through a window. I needed the original. The genuine article. My true last will and testament, the real one Beatrice Hale had drafted, and I had signed and video recorded 4 years earlier. The one that honored Camille's foundation. The one whose existence would prove the breakfast table document a forgery on its face. And I needed the notarial certificate and the signing video that lived with it. I kept them in the old ship's safe behind the paneling of my study, the study Nathaniel now used, the study where the compass sat gloating on the desk. I could not ask for them. Requesting my own documents would tip the whole plan. So on the night Nathaniel threw his annual harbor gala, 300 guests, a marquee on the lawn, valets and a band, the whole house lit up and turned outward toward the water. I signed myself out of Golden Harbor for a family event, which Tessa had arranged on the books, and Cormac Ashford drove me to the bottom of my own property in an unremarkable car. I went in through the boathouse. There has been a spare key to the house's terrace door, hidden under the third floorboard of that boathouse for 30 years. Landsmen forget the water. Nathaniel had changed every lock in the house and installed cameras at every door, and had never once thought about the wooden launch under canvas at the bottom of the garden, or the man who used to hide there. I let myself onto the dark terrace behind the marquee's glow, slipped through the unused morning room, and climbed the back stairs to the study while 300 guests laughed and the band played beneath me. It was, I noted with a grim private humor, the second time in a month I had haunted my own house during a party thrown in my honor. The study was dark. The compass sat on the desk, catching a blade of light from the window. I did not touch it. Not yet. First the work. I knelt at the paneling, found the seam my own hands had cut 30 years ago, and swung it open. The old ship's safe, a heavy mechanical brute I'd bought off a decommissioned freighter, still answered to the combination I'd never written down. Camille's birthday. Forward. Reverse. Forward. The tumblers falling into place under my fingers like soundings coming back off a familiar bottom. Inside, the real will, crisp and legitimate. The notary's raised seal. The sealed envelope with the signing video. I slid them into the flat leather folio strapped beneath my coat, and that is when I heard the study door handle turn. I have told you that panic is the enemy of a clear mind. I did not panic. I moved silent, fast, 40 years of moving quietly through sleeping ships on night watch into the deep shadow behind the open door of the adjoining map room, and I pulled it to within an inch, and I stopped breathing the way I learned to stop breathing in a smoke-filled hold, and I waited. Sloane came in. Just Sloane, in her gala gown, muttering to herself, looking for the phone she'd left on the desk. The band thumped up through the floor. She crossed to the desk, close enough that I could smell her perfume through the crack, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the crimson silk of her sleeve. I counted her steps on the hardwood the way I once counted a leadsman's soundings. 7 steps to the desk. She found the phone. Then she did not leave. She stopped. She turned, slowly, and she looked directly at the paneling. At the panel I had left standing open 6 inches in the dark. My heart was a fist against my sternum. Every second stretched into a sounding of its own 1, 2, 3, and I watched her frown at the open panel, and I watched her take 1 step toward it, and I made ready, in that endless suspended instant, to walk out of the shadow and end the entire game right there, 3 weeks early, on the worst possible ground. Then a voice called up the stairs, "Nathaniel," from the party. "Sloane, the Hendersons are leaving," and she made an irritated sound. And she pushed the panel shut with the toe of her shoe without looking behind it, and she walked out with her phone and her drink, and the door closed, and the band played on, and I stood in the dark with my dead wife's documents against my heart, and did not breathe for a full minute more. 17 steps. That is how far it was from where she stood to where I hid. I have never in my life counted anything so precisely. I left the way I came, through the boathouse, into Cormac's waiting car. But I did not leave empty-handed beyond the folio. On my way past the desk, at the very last, I let myself do one small forbidden thing. I did not take the compass. It was not time. A missing trophy would raise an alarm. But I laid one finger on the cold brass of it, on the engraved initials, mine and Camille's twined together, and I made it a promise. Soon. I'm coming back for you soon. Cormac was waiting with the engine running, and the third tide already breaking over him, and it was the one that changed everything. "Captain," he said, before I had the door shut, "I traced the money. I need you to sit down for this, because it is worse than we thought in 3 separate directions." He had followed the paper on the sale, because Langley and Nathaniel were not merely planning to control my estate. They had already, quietly, arranged to liquidate it. The house, the reclaimed company shares, the very marina slip, all of it was under a pending private sale, structured to close 24 hours after the guardianship hearing. The instant a judge signed me into Golden Harbor for good, my entire life's work would be sold out from under me before I could draw 3 breaths of protest. That was the first thing. The second thing was in Langley's history. Cormac had found 2 prior guardianship cases in 2 prior counties, both handled by Ambrose Langley, both involving wealthy elderly clients with no children of their own to raise an alarm. In both, the client had been declared incompetent, institutionalized, and stripped of everything. And one of them, a widow named Eleanor Sloss, had died in a locked memory ward 14 months later, her estate already dissolved, her name already erased. This was not a family tragedy Langley had wandered into. It was his trade. Nathaniel and Sloane were not his partners. They were his instrument, the same as Consuela, the same as Whitfield, the same as a bought signature. They thought they had hired a lawyer. They had been recruited by a serial predator who had done this before and buried the evidence in a memory ward. And the third thing, Cormac turned in the driver's seat and looked at me, and the streetlight caught the old investigator's face, and I saw on it the same expression he must have worn the day he refused to sign the scuttling report. "The private buyer," he said. "The shell company that's set to purchase your entire estate the day after the hearing." I cracked the ownership. It runs back through 3 holding layers to a single beneficial owner. He paused. "It's Langley. He isn't just taking his fee, Captain. He's arranged to buy the whole thing himself, at a fraction of its worth, through a shell your son has never heard of. When this is done, Nathaniel and Sloane get their inheritance on paper, and then discover Langley has structured the sale so that he walks away with the house, the company, and the money, and they're left holding a poisoned estate and a felony they can't confess to without hanging themselves. I sat very still in that dark car, and I began at last to understand the true shape of the thing. My son had set out to erase the man who made him, and in his greed and his grievance, he had handed his own throat, and his wife's, to a man who ate old people for a living, and was about to eat the 2 of them last. I had 5 days until the hearing. I had a nurse's apron recorder, a watermark that betrayed a date, a real will locked to my chest, and the sworn families of a dead widow named Eleanor Sloss. I had a compass on a desk I had promised to reclaim. It would have to be enough. I had brought ships through worse with less. 2 days before the hearing, Nathaniel came to Golden Harbor to see me, and I let him, because a captain does not waste a rising tide, and I had one last thing to say to my son, while he still believed I was drowning. He came in the visiting hour, and he brought flowers, and he performed. There is a camera in the corner of the Golden Harbor day room, and Nathaniel played to it the way he had played to the doctor's notepad, the devoted son, kneeling beside the old man's chair, holding the frail hand, murmuring reassurances loud enough for the lens. He told me the hearing was just a formality. He told me it was to protect me. He told me Mom would have wanted him to take care of me this way. That last one was the mistake. He should not have put Camille's name in his mouth. I let my eyes stay foggy and my hands stay limp in his for the camera, and then I leaned forward, slowly, as though I were only shifting my weight, until my mouth was 6 inches from his ear, and my voice was too low for any lens or microphone in that room to catch, and I said the only sentence I had prepared, in the clear, cold, level command voice he had not heard from me in 3 weeks, the voice from the bridge, the voice that had once ordered him hauled out of the North Sea. "You stopped being my son," I said, "the moment you priced my life at a room overlooking the parking lot." Then I sat back and let my face go slack and vacant again before he could react. I have never seen a man's soul change color so fast. Nathaniel went white to the lips. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He stared at me, searching my dull, wandering eyes for the man who had just spoken, and he could not find him. I made sure he could not find him, and I watched a horror climb up behind his face as he began to wonder whether he had heard it at all, or whether the old man was simply babbling, or whether, worst of all, the drowning captain was not drowning. He left without the flowers. He forgot them on the table. And I knew, watching him go, that I had planted a splinter of doubt in the one man on their side who still had a conscience left to infect, and that the splinter would work on him for 2 days, right up until the moment in that courtroom, when doubt would no longer do him any good at all. The trap itself, Beatrice Hale and Cormac Ashford and I built in 3 quiet days, and its beauty was that we built almost none of it. We simply arranged the water so the current would do the work. The genius of what these people had done, the reason it had worked twice before and buried a widow named Eleanor Sloss, was that all the crimes were hidden: a forged will in a folio, a staged gas leak with a bought witness, a doctored medication log in a private file. Each one, alone, could be explained away by a smooth attorney to a busy judge. If I stood up and shouted forgery, it was my word, the incompetent's word, against a lawyer, a doctor, a son, and a housekeeper. I would lose. So we would not make them defend hidden crimes. We would make Ambrose Langley commit a fresh one in the open, on the record, in front of the judge, in real time. Because Langley's whole strategy depended on submitting his manufactured evidence to the court, he had to file the forged will. He had to enter the doctored medical records and the fraudulent wandering incident addendum into the official record to win the guardianship. The moment he did that, the moment those forged documents crossed from his folio into the hands of a judge as sworn evidence, he would not merely be holding a forgery, he would be uttering it, knowingly presenting a forged instrument to a court as genuine. A separate, serious, provable felony, committed live, witnessed by everyone in the room, the pen practically in his hand. We did not have to stop him from walking into the courtroom. We had to make absolutely certain he walked in confident, unwarned, and carrying every forged page, and then we had to be ready. At the precise instant he handed them up, to prove them false beyond the possibility of a smooth explanation. For that I needed 3 instruments, and I gathered them. The first was Dr. Ades Okafor, a forensic document examiner Beatrice had used before, a woman who could put the forged will and its watermark under a spectrometer and testify, with a chain of manufacturing records, that the paper and the ink dated from 2 years ago and could not possibly have been signed 4 years ago. The physical impossibility, the phantom cargo. The second was Tessa Vaughn, who agreed, knowing it would cost her the job and might cost her more to testify in open court to what she had been hired to do, and to authenticate the recording of Langley directing my son to fabricate the wandering incident, the living witness. The third was the sworn families of Eleanor Sloss and Langley's other prior victim, whom Cormac had found and who had waited years for someone to believe them. Their complaint to the State Bar Association we timed to land, formally, on the morning of my hearing, so that as Langley stood in one courtroom committing his crime, the record of his pattern would be arriving on the desk of the very body that licensed him. The current, arriving from the opposite direction, and the real will, with its notary seal and its 4-year-old signing video, stayed strapped to my chest, unmentioned, unhinted, the fixed star I would not reveal until the sky was fully dark. The night before the hearing, I sat once more in the boathouse with Camille's small compass in my fist, and I did not sleep, and I did not want to. I had brought 30 men through a typhoon off Luzon on no sleep and a failing engine. I could bring 3 liars through a courtroom. The guardianship hearing was held in a small, bright, wood-paneled county courtroom on a Thursday morning, before a brisk and unsentimental judge named Harlan Voss, and I made my entrance exactly as the enemy had scripted it, because I had let them keep the script. I came in a wheelchair. Tessa pushed it, her face a careful mask. I wore an old cardigan, and I let my head loll and my eyes drift, and my hands tremble in my lap. And I looked, to every soul in that room, like precisely what the petition claimed, a frail, failing old man who had wandered too far from shore to find his way back. Nathaniel would not meet my eyes. Sloane sat beside him, composed and lovely and lethal. And Ambrose Langley rose, smiling his warm, dead smile, and opened his folio, and began. He was, I will grant him, magnificent. He spoke to Judge Voss for 20 minutes in that soft, reasonable, sorrowing voice, and he built the drowning old man plank by plank. He submitted the will, the captain's own testamentary wishes, executed 4 years ago, when his mind was sound, and handed it up to the bench. He submitted Dr. Whitfield's letter and the medication records. And then, with exquisite regret, he submitted the emergency addendum, the sworn account of the wandering incident at the marina, the drowning risk, dated that very week. He laid the whole forged fleet before the judge as sworn evidence, every falsified page, exactly as we had prayed he would. He handed up the murder weapon with his fingerprints already on it, and he did not know it, and he smiled. "Your Honor," Langley said gently, "it grieves this family to be here, but the captain is a danger to himself. We ask the court to act today, for his own protection." Judge Voss looked down at the trembling old man in the wheelchair. "Captain Rourke," he said, not unkindly, "is there anything you wish to say before I rule?" Beatrice Hale rose. "Your Honor, my client would like to address the court, and he would like to stand to do it." A ripple went through the room. Langley's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went very still. I put my hands on the arms of the wheelchair, and I stood up, not the trembling half-rise of a failing man. I stood the way I had stood on a heaving bridge for 40 years, spine straight, shoulders square, feet planted against a deck that wanted to throw me, and I let the fog fall off my face like water off an oilskin, and when I spoke, it was in the voice that had carried over gale-force wind, and it filled that small courtroom to the corners. "My name is Elias Rourke," I said. "I am a master mariner. I have kept a ship's log every day for 40 years, and I have never once, in 4 decades, entered a false position. So let me read you from my log." And I read them the truth from memory, no notes, no papers, the clear sequential recall of a man whose whole life had trained him to hold a course in his head. The date and hour I supposedly left the gas range on. I gave the court my exact movements that night, the book I read, the time I slept, and I noted that I had not cooked in that house in 2 years. The date of the wandering incident Langley had just sworn to. I informed the court I had been a checked-in resident of Golden Harbor that entire night, with a nurse's log to prove I never left the building, and that the incident described in the sworn addendum in the judge's hand had never happened at all, that it had been invented, on instruction, 4 days before it was dated. Langley was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of confabulation." "Dr. Okafor," Beatrice said. The forensic examiner took the stand, and in flat, patient, unshakable technical language, she took the forged will apart. "The security watermark in the paper, manufactured beginning 2 years ago," she testified, "with the mill's production records to prove it. The ink of the signature, a gel formulation released to market in that same window. A document dated 4 years ago," she concluded, "signed with materials that did not exist until 2 years ago. Physically, chemically, absolutely impossible. A forgery on its face." The color left Nathaniel's cheeks. Sloane's hand found the edge of the table. Then Beatrice played Tessa's recording into the silent courtroom, and Ambrose Langley's own warm voice rolled through the room, directing my son to fabricate the marina story, promising to date the addendum before the hearing, the very addendum lying at that moment in Judge Voss's hands. And Tessa took the stand and told the court, in a voice that shook and did not stop, what she had been hired to do, and why she could not do it, and about a grandmother named Eleanor, who died in 11 months in a place worse than this. And last, from beneath my coat, I drew the folio, and Beatrice submitted to the court my true will, genuine, notarized, honoring Camille's foundation, accompanied by the sealed video of its signing 4 years earlier, in which a clear-eyed, unmistakably sound, Captain Elias Rourke stated his wishes to the camera and the room. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Voss looked down at the fraudulent documents in his own hands, then at Langley, and his face had gone from unsentimental to something much harder. "Mr. Langley," the judge said, very quietly, "you submitted these documents to this court, under oath, as genuine, not 10 minutes ago. And Ambrose Langley, this is the part I will remember until I die." Ambrose Langley smiled his warm, dead smile, and reached calmly into his folio, and said, Your Honor, if I may submit one final supplementary exhibit that will clarify. He drew out one more forged page and began to hand it up, straight into the waiting jaws of the exact trap he had spent his whole poisonous career building for other people. Ambrose Langley handed the final forged page up to the bench, and in doing so he committed, live and on the record, and in front of a judge who now understood exactly what he was watching, his last and most provable felony. He had done it 1,000 times in his career. Submit one more document, smooth over one more crack, control the narrative with paper. It was the only reflex he had, and it was the reflex we had built the entire trap around, because a man who cannot stop reaching for another forged page will eventually reach for one over an open snare. Judge Voss did not take the page. "Bailiff," he said. The two men who had been standing at the back of the courtroom in plain suits since before I arrived, men Nathaniel had assumed were court staff, men who were in fact investigators from the State Attorney General's Economic Crimes Unit. Alerted by the bar complaint, Cormac had time to land that very morning, moved up the center aisle, and in the same moment, a clerk slipped through the side door and laid a folder on the judge's bench, the formal, docketed complaint from the families of Eleanor Sloss and Langley's second victim, arriving, as we had arranged, at the precise hour of his crime. The current had come in from the opposite direction, twice as hard, and it took everything that was not tied down. They arrested Ambrose Langley at the petitioner's table, in front of the client family he had recruited, and I watched the warm, dead smile finally leave his face, not in fear, at first, but in a kind of professional astonishment, the look of a man who has spent his life as the water and cannot understand how he has suddenly become the drowning thing. The forged page was still in his fingers when the cuffs closed. He looked, for one instant, directly at me. I looked back at him with no expression at all. I had looked at forged manifests the same way for 40 years. A lie that wears a stamp is still just a lie, and I have never once been impressed by one. That was the criminal blow. But I had promised these people a reckoning that reached every part of their lives, and there was still the matter of the money and the matter of the thing they had all, from the very first day, so completely misunderstood. I turned to face Nathaniel and Sloane, and I let them see, for the first time, the whole of it. For 3 weeks, I said, every one of you called me a pauper, a burden, a helpless old man living on his son's charity, eating his son's bread, sleeping in a room his son so generously provided. I let the words settle. You built this entire scheme on the belief that everything I had was already, in effect, yours, the company, the house, the accounts, and that all you needed was a judge's signature to make it official. I let the silence stretch the way I had let it stretch on a heaving deck, waiting for the wave. You never once thought to ask the registry who actually holds the paper. Because here is the secret I had carried, quietly, for 6 years, the fixed star none of them ever knew was in the sky. When Camille was dying, and the medical costs were bleeding the company, Rourke Maritime nearly foundered. Nathaniel, running it by then, had taken on debt to keep it afloat, mortgaged the marina slip, leveraged the shares, borrowed against the house he did not know was not entirely his. And through those hard years, quietly, through a modest holding company I had formed and named Harbor Light for the light, Camille always left burning in the window when I was at sea. I had bought that debt. All of it. Every note, every lien, every mortgage. I did not do it to control my son. I did it to protect him, the way I had always protected him, from the sea and from himself, so that if the company ever failed, it would fail into my hands and not a stranger's, and I could quietly forgive it and set him on his feet again. The son I saved from drowning had spent 3 weeks trying to erase me while living, every single day, inside a house whose every beam I already held the paper on. Harbor Light Holdings owns your debt, I told him, and my voice did not rise, because it did not need to. The mortgage on the house, the lien on the marina slip, the paper on the company shares, all of it comes due, in full, on my call. And I am calling it. Sloane made a small sound. Nathaniel did not move at all. Never, I said, mistake an old captain's silence for surrender. The alliance did not survive the courthouse steps. Out in the marble corridor, in the cold light through the tall windows, the truth of what Cormac had found finally reached the two of them. That the shell company, waiting to buy the whole estate the day after the hearing, had belonged to Langley. That they had been the instrument and not the partners. That even if their scheme had succeeded, they would have been devoured last. And I stood a little distance off, near the tall windows, and watched a marriage come apart in 90 seconds. Sloane turned on Nathaniel and accused him of dragging her into a felony that was already collapsing. Nathaniel turned on Sloane and, in the reckless honesty of a cornered man, threw back that he had found her forged initials on documents he had never seen, that she had been forging inside their own conspiracy, cutting side deals, protecting herself. Their voices rose. Their hands came up. A court officer had to step between them. The devoted couple, the loving family that had wept so beautifully over my decline, tore at each other in a public hallway while strangers stared, and I felt nothing watching it but the flat, gray calm you feel watching a rotten hull finally break apart in a swell. No triumph. Only the grim confirmation of what was always going to happen to a thing built without a keel. Langley went to prison. 2 counts of forgery and uttering committed in open court, and beneath those, when the state reopened the files, the case of Eleanor Sloss, and the widow before her, enough to ensure he would die inside walls. His license stripped, his name struck from the bar, his warm dead smile spent on cellmates who were not moved by it. The families who had waited years to be believed finally were. Sloane took a plea, a suspended sentence and community service. The forger's initials on the medication log too damning to fight. Her cooperation against Langley the only currency she had left. She and Nathaniel divorced before the year was out. And Nathaniel, my Nathaniel, he turned state's evidence against Langley, and it was his testimony in the end that sealed the older man's fate, the drowning boy testifying against the one who had promised to make him rich. For that cooperation, and because I asked the prosecutor privately for it, he did not go to prison. But I called Harbor Light's paper, all of it, and I did not forgive it this time. And inside of 30 days, the company that bore my name, and the house I had built, and the slip where I had taught him to sail, all passed cleanly and legally back into my hands, and he walked out of the only life he had ever known with what he had come to me with 20 years ago. A canvas bag, and nothing else. That was not cruelty. A father who lets a son drown to spare himself. The effort of the rescue is no father but a father who keeps hauling a grown man out of water he keeps jumping into on purpose, is not saving him. He is only delaying the lesson. I had spent 20 years being the reason Nathaniel never had to stand on his own feet. I was done being that reason. Whatever he became now, he would build himself, or he would not, and it would finally, for the first time in his life, be his. Before I left the house that last day, during the inventory, I walked into the study alone. The brass compass still sat on the desk where he had displayed it as a trophy. I picked it up. I turned it over and read the 2 sets of initials twined together on the base, mine and Camille's, and I felt the weight of it settle into my palm exactly where it belonged. I did not say anything. I did not need to. I simply put it in my coat, and I carried it home. A full year has passed now, and the light is back on in the window. I moved back into my own house, the real one, the one with Camille's compass on the shelf, where it has stood for 6 years, and will stand for whatever years I have left. The reclaimed fortune did not go to me. I am an old man and I need very little. It went where Camille always meant it to go. The Elias Rourke Foundation is larger now than it has ever been, and this year, it is putting the orphan children of 41 lost sailors through school, and a boy from Manila, who reminds me a little of a deckhand I once pulled out of the North Sea, is training to sit for his officer's ticket on my foundation's money. I go to their graduations. I sit in the front row where Camille would have sat. Tessa Vaughn does not work night shifts in memory wards anymore. I funded an organization for her to run, one that does exactly what she could never do for her grandmother. It investigates elder guardianship fraud and stands beside old people who have no one to believe them. She is very good at it. Predators like Ambrose Langley are learning, one case at a time, that the invisible nurse in the corner is watching now, and remembering, and that the furniture can think. Cormac Ashford and I have lunch every Thursday at a place down by the marina, and he has never once let me pay, and I have finally stopped trying, because I have learned that letting a good man repay a debt is its own kind of gift. And Nathaniel? I saw him once, months ago, through the window of a diner near the working docks, wiping down a counter. He did not see me. I stood on the wet street a long moment and looked at the man I pulled out of the sea, and I felt the old love move in me, unkillable, and beside it the harder thing that has to live alongside love when love has been betrayed. I have not spoken to him. I have not forgiven him, but I have not closed the door and thrown the bolt either, because Camille would not have let me, and because a harbor that turns away every battered ship is not a harbor at all. He knows where the light is, whether he ever sails back toward it, and whether he arrives as a different man than the one who left, is the one voyage I cannot chart for him. Now let me speak to you directly, because this story was never only mine. If you are a grown son or a grown daughter, I need you to hear the thing that nearly cost me my freedom and my name. Your aging mother, your aging father, the moment someone begins to tell you, gently and often, that the old one is confused, that they don't remember, that they can't manage anymore, that they need to be protected from themselves, stop. Slow down. Ask who benefits from that story. Because the cruelest, most profitable crime of our age is not committed against the young. It is committed against the old, by the people they trusted most, using the one weapon a lifetime of love leaves undefended, the assumption that family would never put a price on your life. Sometimes the confusion is real, and then God bless you for your care. But sometimes it is a script. Learn the difference before you sign anything. And if you are old like me, and you feel the people around you beginning to talk over your head as though you have already left the room, do not rage, and do not despair. Go quiet. Watch. Keep your log. Your silence is not weakness. It is the last power no one can take from you, because they will say anything in front of a man they have decided is already gone. Stay on your feet. Read the tilt in the deck, and find the one honest soul, a nurse, an old friend, a lawyer, a stranger who has seen this before, and hold on. Do not let go. If this story showed you that the quiet ones are not the weak ones, that an old captain's patience is not surrender, then do me that one favor I asked for at the start. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me down in the comments what city you are listening from tonight. I read every single one. I will see you on the next voyage. Keep your log honest, and keep a light in your window.